Hey everyone, I want to give a special shout out to all of you who have been supporting my channel by subscribing and watching my horror stories regularly. I'm sending you all my love. And a big hello to everyone who's new to my channel. I hope you'll enjoy the creepy stories that I write for you. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel to get more similar scary stories. Tonight, I have a horror story from the deep south for you. It's about a hitchhiker from hell who messes with your head. Stick around until the end of this exciting story. Enjoy. The desert has a way of playing tricks on your mind. I learned that lesson the hard way on a scorching July afternoon when the temperature gauge on my beat-up Ford hit 113 degrees. The shimmer of heat waves rising from the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead of me made the world look like it was melting, distorting everything into a surreal dance of light and shadow. My name is Stan Waters, and this is where my nightmare began. I was running, not in the literal sense, though that would come later, but running from something worse, myself. 3 days earlier, I'd walked out on my job at Thornton and Associates, leaving behind 15 years of corporate slavery and a corner office with a view. Serena Thornton, my boss and longtime mentor, had tried to stop me. "You're making a mistake, Stan," she'd said, her usually perfectly composed face showing genuine concern. "This isn't like you." Maybe that was exactly why I had to do it. The radio had died somewhere outside of Las Vegas, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the monotonous hum of tires on pavement. I'd been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, no real destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to put distance between myself and everything I'd left behind in Phoenix. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast ocean of sand and scrub brush beneath a merciless sun. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was another mirage, just another trick of the heat and my tired eyes. But as I got closer, the figure solidified. A man standing on the shoulder of the road, thumb extended in the universal gesture of hitchhikers. He wore dark jeans and a white t-shirt that seemed to glow in the intense sunlight. Something about him made me slow down, though every movie I'd ever watched screamed at me not to. I pulled over. The man jogged up to my passenger window, and I got my first good look at him. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe late 20s, with sandy blonde hair and the kind of face you'd expect to see in a college brochure. Trustworthy, friendly, utterly normal. He smiled, and I felt something in my gut twist. "Thanks for stopping," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I've been out here for hours. Name's Eli." I hesitated for a moment before responding. "Stan, where you headed?" "East," he said, then added with a laugh. "Anywhere east, really. Just trying to get away from the West Coast." That made 2 of us. I nodded toward the passenger seat. "Hop in." As soon as he settled into the seat beside me, I noticed something odd about his movements. They were too precise, almost mechanical, like someone trying too hard to appear natural. I pulled back onto the highway, trying to shake off my unease. The air conditioning struggled against the heat, and sweat trickled down my back. "So what brings you out to the middle of nowhere?" I asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. Eli's head snapped toward me with an unnaturally quick motion. "Same as you, probably. Starting fresh." His neck twitched, a sudden violent movement that he tried to disguise as adjusting his collar. Everyone needs a clean slate sometimes, right? I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Yeah, I suppose they do. For the next hour, we drove in relative silence, broken only by Eli's occasional comments about the landscape or the weather. Each time he spoke, I noticed more peculiarities in his behavior. His head would jerk to the side at random intervals, and his face would contort into brief but disturbing expressions before snapping back to normal. He'd catch me looking and smile that perfect, friendly smile, but it never quite reached his eyes. The sun was starting to set when things really began to unravel. We were passing through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when Eli started humming. It wasn't any tune I recognized, just a discordant series of notes that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. His head twitching had gotten worse, and his hands were moving restlessly in his lap, fingers tapping out an erratic rhythm on his thighs. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to me, and this time the smile was different, twisted, almost manic. "I know what you did," he said, his voice suddenly deeper, more guttural. "I know about Thea." My blood ran cold. There was no way he could know about Thea Baxter. That was buried deep in my past, a secret I'd kept for 20 years. The accident, the cover-up, the way I'd let someone else take the fall. It was impossible. Eli's body began to convulse, his back arching against the seat. The humming turned into a high-pitched keening sound that filled the car. His head snapped back and forth, faster and faster, and his face contorted into a grotesque mask of rage and pain. "Stop the car," he screamed, his voice no longer human. "Stop the car." I slammed on the brakes, the Taurus skidding on the loose gravel of the shoulder. Before we'd fully stopped, I reached across him, yanked open the passenger door, and shoved him out with all my strength. He tumbled onto the dirt, rolling several times before coming to a stop. My heart pounding, I hit the gas, tires spinning in the gravel before finding purchase. In my rearview mirror, I saw Eli rise to his feet with an unnatural grace. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the road, his head cocked at an impossible angle. As the distance between us grew, I could swear I saw his face change, features melting and shifting like wax under a flame. But it was his eyes that haunted me most, completely black now, like empty holes in reality itself. And in the dying light of the desert sunset, I realized something that made my blood turn to ice. He was smiling that perfect, friendly smile, and he was pointing right at me. I drove through the night, trying to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. Because when I finally stopped to get gas at a lonely station just before dawn, I saw something that made my heart stop. Scratched into the dust on my back window were 5 words. "Thea Baxter says hello, Stan." Running on nothing but gas station coffee and paranoia, I made it to Gallup, New Mexico, just as the sun was clawing its way over the horizon. My hands hadn't stopped shaking since I'd seen that message on my back window, and every shadow in my peripheral vision seemed to dance with malicious intent. I needed a place to think, to plan, somewhere I could figure out how the hell Eli knew about Thea Baxter and what he wanted from me. The Desert Rose Motel looked like it hadn't seen a paying customer since the Reagan administration, but its neon vacancy sign buzzed with promise of temporary sanctuary. The clerk, an elderly woman named Terry Hampton according to her nameplate, barely looked up from her romance novel as she handed me a key attached to a plastic tag shaped like a cactus. Room 113. Just my luck. I collapsed onto the bed without even taking off my shoes, the events of the past 24 hours crashing over me like a tidal wave. 20 years. It had been 20 years since that night with Thea, and I'd convinced myself I'd buried it deep enough that it would never surface again. But as I drifted into an exhausted sleep, memories began to seep through the cracks in my carefully constructed walls. 1995, the company Christmas party, Thea Baxter, the new intern, catching my eye across the room. Too much whiskey. Her car keys in my hand because I insisted I was fine to drive. The rain. The truck we didn't see until it was too late. Dominic Dickinson, the young security guard who'd seen us leave together, taking the fall because I convinced him his future depended on it. My promises to take care of his family. Promises I kept, but at what cost to my soul. I jolted awake to the sound of someone knocking on my door. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:47 p.m. I'd slept for almost 9 hours, but felt more exhausted than before. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Waters," Terry Hampton's voice called through the door. "There's someone here asking for you. Says he's your friend from the road." My heart nearly stopped. Impossible. He couldn't have found me here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Hell, I hadn't known myself. I crept to the window and carefully pulled back the dusty curtain. The parking lot was empty except for my Taurus and Terry's ancient Volkswagen Beetle. "Mr. Waters." "Tell them I'm not here," I called back, my voice cracking. "Tell them you made a mistake." Silence. Then, "Okay, honey. Whatever you say." Her footsteps retreated down the concrete walkway. I pressed my eye to the peephole, watching as Terry made her way back to the office. She stopped halfway there, turned around, and looked directly at my door. Her head twitched to the side just like Eli's had. A smile spread across her face, that same perfect, friendly smile that had haunted my rearview mirror. Fuck. I grabbed my keys and wallet, hands trembling so badly I could barely get them into my pockets. The bathroom window was small, but I'd lost enough weight during my desert panic that I managed to squeeze through, dropping into the alley behind the motel. I ran. This time, literally. The streets of Gallup were surprisingly busy for a weekday afternoon. Tourists browsing Native American jewelry, shops, and roadside attractions. I ducked into a diner called Route 66 Eats, sliding into a booth with a clear view of both exits. A waitress with Paige written on her name tag approached with a coffee pot. "Rough day?" she asked, filling my cup without waiting for an answer. I must have looked worse than I thought. "You could say that." She studied me for a moment, head tilted. "You know, you're the second person today who looked like they'd seen a ghost. Earlier this morning, this girl came in, all shook up. Said something about a man who wouldn't stop following her. Weird thing was, nobody else could see him." My coffee cup froze halfway to my mouth. This girl, What did she look like? Pretty thing, maybe 30. Long dark hair, green eyes. Said her name was Lara Foster. The name hit me like a physical blow. Lara Foster had been Thea Baxter's best friend. She'd been the one who'd asked the most questions after the accident. The one who'd never believed the official story about Dominic Dickinson being behind the wheel. Where is she now? Paige shrugged. Said she was heading to the library to look up some old newspapers. Something about needing to confirm a theory about, hey, are you okay? You've gone white as a sheet. I threw a 20 on the table and bolted out the door. The library, of course. The Gallup Herald would have covered the accident. Small town papers always did. And if Lara was here, if she was seeing him too. The library was a squat brick building 3 blocks away. I burst through the doors, earning a stern look from the librarian. The microfilm section was empty, but a newspaper lay abandoned on one of the tables, its pages open to a familiar headline from 20 years ago. Local security guard charged in fatal accident. And there, scrawled in the margin in fresh ink, he's watching you too, isn't he, Stan? I spun around, scanning the rows of books. A figure stood at the end of one aisle. Lara Foster. Exactly as I remembered her, but with that same twisted smile that had corrupted Terry Hampton's face. Her head jerked to the side, and when it snapped back, her features had begun to melt and shift, revealing Eli's face underneath. I ran again, out of the library and into the street. But everywhere I looked, I saw them. The barista in the coffee shop window, the teenager waiting at the bus stop, the police officer directing traffic, all wearing that same smile, all with heads twitching at impossible angles, all slowly turning to watch me pass. I made it back to my car and peeled out of the motel parking lot, tires screaming. In my rearview mirror, I could see them all standing in the street, their bodies beginning to contort and change. And at their center stood Eli, his black eyes boring into mine even from a distance. It wasn't until I was 50 miles down the highway that I noticed something in the passenger seat. A single Polaroid photograph, yellowed with age. It showed Thea Baxter at that Christmas party 20 years ago, smiling at the camera. But as I watched in horror, the image began to change. Her smile widened, becoming that familiar, terrible grin. Her head twisted to the side, and her eyes, once bright and full of life, slowly filled with darkness until they were nothing but empty void staring back at me. Written on the back in handwriting I recognized as my own, though I had no memory of writing it. You can't outrun your ghosts forever, Stan. They're all waiting for you in Phoenix. The signs for Phoenix started appearing around midnight. Each mile marker was a countdown to my inevitable fate, and the desert night seemed to pulse with malevolent anticipation. I hadn't slept in 36 hours, surviving on truck stop coffee and the kind of fear that burns everything else away. The Polaroid photo lay on the passenger seat where I dropped it, though I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. I didn't need to. Thea's transforming face was already burned into my memory. My phone had been buzzing constantly for the past hour. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize, all saying the same thing. Coming home at last? Stan? Each text was signed with a different name from my past. People I'd worked with, people I'd wronged, people I'd thought long forgotten. The last one was from Serena Thornton. We're all waiting in your office. Where it began. Thornton and Associates loomed ahead, its glass and steel facade reflecting the city lights like a massive black mirror. At 3 a.m, the building should have been dark, empty. Instead, every window blazed with fluorescent light, turning the structure into a beacon of awful promise. The parking garage was open, barrier arm raised in welcome. I pulled into my old spot. 15 years of habit die hard, and killed the engine. In the sudden silence, I could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. The elevator door stood open, waiting. As I stepped inside, I noticed the only button illuminated was for the 15th floor. My floor, my office. The ride up felt both eternal and instantaneous. When the doors opened, the familiar layout of cubicles and corner offices had been transformed. The walls seemed to breathe, carpet patterns writhing like living things. And everywhere there were mirrors, hundreds of them, reflecting infinite versions of myself walking through this corporate nightmare. My office door was open, light spilling out into the twisted landscape of what had once been my professional home. As I approached, I could hear voices, countless whispered conversations overlapping into a susurration of accusation and judgment. I recognized them all. Eli sat in my chair, feet propped up on my desk, wearing that same white t-shirt that somehow still glowed despite the fluorescent lighting. But he wasn't alone. They were all there. Serena Thornton, looking exactly as she had the day I'd walked out, except for those black, empty eyes. Lara Foster, her face constantly shifting between her own features and Eli's. Terry Hampton from the motel, Paige from the diner, and dozens of others, all wearing that same terrible smile, all watching me with void dark eyes. And in the center of them all stood Thea Baxter, exactly as she'd looked that Christmas night 20 years ago. "Welcome home, Stan," Eli said, his head twitching violently to the side. "We've been waiting a very long time for this reunion." "What are you?" My voice sounded thin, frightened. The voice of a man finally facing his sins. Eli's smile widened impossibly. "I'm whatever you need me to be, Stan. A reminder, a consequence, a mirror." His face began to shift, features melting and reforming. "But mostly I'm a debt collector, and you owe so very, very much." Thea stepped forward, and I noticed something I hadn't before. Her footsteps left wet prints on the carpet. Water dripped from her clothes, her hair, creating an ever-expanding pool around her feet. The same rain-soaked appearance she'd had when I'd pulled her body from the wreckage. "You let an innocent man take the fall," she said, her voice garbled as if speaking through water. "Dominic Dickinson lost everything because of you. His wife left him. His children grew up ashamed. He died alone last week in a state facility, still protesting his innocence. I provided for his family," I protested weakly. "I made sure they were taken care of with blood money." Lara Foster's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You built your entire career on Thea's death and Dominic's sacrifice. Every promotion, every bonus, every corner office, all of it stained with their suffering." The others began to move closer, a circle of accusers tightening around me. Each step they took transformed them further, their bodies contorting into impossible shapes, their faces becoming fluid masks of judgment and rage. The walls of my office began to run like melting wax, and I could smell rain and whiskey and the metallic tang of blood. "Please," I whispered, though I wasn't sure what I was begging for. Mercy, understanding, a chance to make it right. Eli rose from my chair, his body elongating unnaturally as he moved. "There's only one way to balance the scales, Stan. One way to pay the debt." He held out his hand, and in it was a set of car keys, my old keys from that night. "We're going for a drive, all of us, back to the scene, back to the moment of choice." I looked at the keys, then at the faces surrounding me. Thea's drowned features, Lara's righteous anger, Cyrena's disappointed glare, and all the others I'd sacrificed on my climb to success. 20 years of guilt given form and voice come to collect their due. "Will it end?" I asked. "If I go with you, will it end?" Eli's smile was almost gentle now, despite his grotesquely stretched form. "Everything ends, Stan. That's the only promise any of us get." I reached for the keys, and that's when I saw it, my own reflection in one of the countless mirrors. But I wasn't reaching for keys. I was sitting in my office chair, tie loose around my neck, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on the desk in front of me. The resignation letter I'd tried to give Serena lay crumpled beside it, and standing over me, wearing an expression of genuine concern, was Serena Thornton, the real Serena, not the black-eyed phantom of my guilt. "Stay with me, Stan." Her voice seemed to come from very far away. "The ambulance is coming. Just stay with me." The phantom figures began to fade, their accusing faces dissolving like smoke. Only Eli remained solid, watching me with those infinite black eyes. "See you soon, Stan," he said, his smile knowing. "After all, this is just the beginning of your penance." As consciousness slipped away, I saw one final reflection. Myself at the wheel of my car in the desert, passing a lone figure on the side of the road. But this time, I wasn't the driver. I was the hitchhiker, and I was smiling that perfect, friendly smile.